Is KAZU, Pacific Grove, Radio with a Choice. My name is Mae Brussell. The name of the program is World Watchers. It is program number 825, September the 28th, 1987. Before I begin the program, I want to say the views expressed here are those of myself or my guests when I have them, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you the following hour of World Watchers. And the following hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. And how much news there is this week, I will be rolling along, trying not to go faster than ever, but there is so much and impossible to cover in an hour, but I'll do the best that I can. First of all, I want to call attention to an article I found in the LA Herald. It hasn't been printed too much, but it has been mentioned on a few programs that Mr. Gorbachev, the Soviet Communist Party chief, Mikhail Gorbachev, has not been seen since August the 6th. A newspaper in the Soviet Union, the name is Bild, B-I-L-D, said that he had serious food poisoning while he was visiting the Black Sea, had a vacation, was hospitalized, and that he was taken back to Moscow on a train, not on his usual airplane. And they called attention to the fact that there was an assassination attempt in February when a police car was filled with explosives and was discovered one day before he visited Reagan. Now, I've mentioned many times that the goal of Nancy Reagan is to get her husband's face carved in Mount Rushmore, and time is running out. So they have to have some kind of a peace proposal, and all of a sudden he's hurrying with a peace proposal that I'm sure the Soviet Union knows has nothing to do with peace. We're escalating the Star War funds at the same time that he wants a summit in order to reduce 3% of the nuclear weapons placed in Europe that the Americans and the Soviet Union have, and a few more technicalities that don't even scratch the surface, as we tested a new bomb in Nevada this week. And there are people that would not trust Ronald Reagan, I'm sure, and wouldn't want a peace conference with Ronald Reagan. I wouldn't want it either if I were the Soviet Union. I don't know who's poisoning Gorbachev, but remember the meeting of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and Nikita Khrushchev, where Eisenhower hoped also to have a goal of peace after World War II and after World War I. And on the eve of a summit, the U-2 flight was down, and Nikita Khrushchev accused Eisenhower of doing what he said he wouldn't do, using the U-2 planes to spy, and he had ordered the planes not to be flying at that time so they could have somewhat of a mini detente, and that was called off, and the rest of that is history. Norman Cousins wrote a book called The Improbable Triumvirate regarding John Kennedy, Pope John the 23rd, and Nikita Khrushchev. It came out in 1972. And the gist of the book is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 62, up to the time when John Kennedy was murdered, November 63, there was a new spirit of optimism at work in the world, that the dramatic end of that crisis signaled an upturn in prospects for peace. Three men came to symbolize the new prospects: President John Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, and Pope John the 23rd. And Pope John the 23rd was also working with Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered in the Congo right in the same time period that Pope John died of cancer and John Kennedy was murdered in November. The Pope died in May, Kennedy died in November, and then the Soviet Union immediately removed Nikita Khrushchev, probably realizing that that peace effort was over now, given the circumstances that took place. Also blaming Lee Harvey Oswald as being an agent of the Soviet Union who would want to talk peace anymore with the United States. It turns out that Norman Cousins became a very active person in the peace movement. He represented John Kennedy with the nuclear test ban treaty and made proposals to the Congress for the nuclear test ban treaty, and there have been many articles based on the fact that Kennedy's assassination could have been motivated in part by persons not wanting the nuclear test ban treaty. And Norman Cousins got the Peace Medal at the United Nations, awarded by U Thant in 1963. U Thant was replaced by Mr. Waldheim, and you've heard the stories about Waldheim and his World War II record. He got a peace medal from Pope John the 23rd for his part in peace. And, of course, all of that effort was gone by the November 63. And then Norman Cousins wrote a book, The Anatomy of an Illness, as perceived by a patient. It was published in 1979. And in that book, he tells how he got seriously ill in 1964 after his friend, the Pope, John 23rd, was dead and Kennedy was dead. He was in Europe. He came home and he had a terrible disease and went into the hospital immediately. And the illness surfaced, and he was it was August 64, less than a year from the time his friend John Kennedy was killed. He was in the hospital, and he said within a week, it was difficult to move my neck, arms, hands, fingers, and legs. The sedimentation rate was over 80. And what he said was that 4 technicians came into his room from 4 different departments for separate and large amount of blood samples and started coming the second day to fill their containers with blood. And he heard them talking about how he was going to die. And he has lectured about this ever since and talks to people about this subject and was reluctant to discuss it for quite a few years. This happened in 1964. And then he checked himself out of the hospital. The rest is history. He knew that he was going to be literally killed in the hospital and not gotten well. He heard them talking about his imminent death, got out, got himself some books with humor, put himself, I believe, at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and recuperated at a will to live, heard them talking about his death. And that would have been John Paul XXIII and John Kennedy and Norman Cousins, one after the other, that worked closely together. And as I say, Khrushchev was out of the running. So just mentioning Gorbachev's illness at a time when he's making an effort for peace and trying to be more open, we'll have to it remains to see what happens to him, but it's worth calling attention to it. Well, for the past 4 weeks, I've been talking about the links of the White House, the National Security Council, Oliver North, Albert Hakim, and General Secord, to the Middle East narcotics traffic, the arms for narcotics, the terrorist groups that they were allegedly put together to fight, the great anti-terrorist group in the National Security Council, Ollie North's almost direct links, buying arms for the Contras from persons supplying Abu Abbas and George Habash of the PLO, and then the next week it was his friend Abu Nidal, and then 4 consecutive weeks the links of this administration to the actual terrorists became more open and exposed. And then there was this gigantic arrest in Italy several weeks ago where 32 people were arrested, and they were from the very comfortable right, a group of people that were sending 3 million mines to Iran. The company was owned 50% by Mr. Agnelli, a co-chairman of Kissinger Associates, and it included plans to kill Ronald Reagan. And the prosecutor said several weeks ago that this story would turn half of Europe upside down. Well, one gentleman who would have gone belly under, upside down, who's directly linked to the Syrian drug connection, to the late Henry Arsan, is Licio Gelli. He got the message loud and clear and turned himself in to the authorities in Switzerland just this past week, since I was on the air last Monday. Now, if you don't take the New York Times and you don't read Wall Street Journal, then you don't even know that the great Licio Gelli is now allegedly in a Swiss hospital for a very bad heart. I think he wants to prove that he has a heart and he needs heart surgery. That even may be a hoax based upon his background. Gelli was indicted, the Wall Street Journal reminds people, for the breaking up of the Banco Ambrosiano. He's wanted for the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano that's linked to the Vatican Bank and Paul Marcinkus and John Paul II. He's wanted in Italy and Florence for the Bologna bombing and for the combined murder of over 92 people. He has been described as part of an armed band involved with political and military espionage, conspiracy, subversive association, extortion, and fraud. This is the gentleman that went to Ronald Reagan's inauguration the first time and could have been there the second time disguised. He's very close to Michael Ledeen, the National Security Council, and the Reagan administration. Wall Street Journal said that he appeared at Geneva at the Champ de Hollande prison. That's where he escaped. He paid the people to let him walk out a few years ago, 4.5 years ago, and he's so important in knowing a lot of the key pieces of the Iran-Contra affair, particularly, and the new scandals breaking up in the Middle East, which are the really, really big story. The others are important, but this makes a full circle from Brazil, South America, Colombia, Brazil, and Bolivia, and then to Syria, and then back to Italy, and then back to New York to the banks of E.F. Hutton and Merrill Lynch that I've done broadcasts about. The Wall Street Journal says that Gelli paid the guards 4.5 years ago to get out. Now he's returned, and he's in poor health, and the doctors are going to tell him whether he can testify at some of these trials. The Swiss government has agreed to keep him until he serves his time there for matters that he's been charged with, and then hopefully, if he lives that long, he'll go to Italy. He's aware of the fact, of course, that his co-partner, Roberta Calvi, was hung in London, and Michele Sindona was given cyanide in the Rome jail, and Francesco Pazienza, his co-partner in the Bologna bombing of no less than 80 people and injuring 160, he's sitting in Italian jail with his friend Stefano Della Calle, one of the godfathers of the strategy of tension. So he appeared this past week, and the Wall Street Journal said it seemed possible last night that Mr. Gelli planned to talk to Italian authorities, but it was uncertain whether he would have the opportunity. The Swiss Justice Ministry said Gelli would have to serve his sentence in Switzerland before extradition was considered to Italy, and he is hinting and offering to testify after his heart surgery. Now, that's a really funny term, after the heart surgery. 50% of the people in Europe would want him to die on the table, and 50% would want him to live so he can tell where the $1.2 billion is in dummy fronts in Panama, how many Contras and death squads he funded, and how many links to the American intelligence community. So I guess it depends who does the surgery and who does the anesthetic on Licio Gelli. It's probably a toss-up, and the nurse who can pull out the tubes. So, as I say, he's under investigation in Rome for the bombings in Florence and Bologna on various charges, which include, again, belonging to an armed band, political and military espionage, conspiracy, subversion, extortion, and fraud. That's about the matter of what they want him for. And just to remind you of past broadcasts I've done, and the Wall Street Journal talks about his being the Grandmaster of the Propaganda Dewey, the Masonic Lodge. Also membership in there includes people like Henry Kissinger and Michael Ledeen. But Gelli was a member of the Waffen SS for Hitler. He was part of Mussolini's MSI. He fought with Francesco Franco, and then he went to Argentina to help Evita Peron put the cash into the Swiss banks that would be used when she mysteriously died after a trip to Europe, where she was given a cancer, or all of a sudden has her quick trip home and then dies conveniently of cancer. And then the money deposited in her name in the banks was unleashed, a minimum of $54 million in cash and over $100 million in gold, some round figure like that. Also, Licio Gelli built the Rat Line. He worked for the United States equivalent of the intelligence operation right after the OSS was forming the CIA in that time period. He helped the Great Klaus Barbie escape, who links up with the Iran-Contras in Central and South America, and the White House team that are in power now. And the Rat Line was notorious with the Vatican of allowing hundreds, maybe 100,000 top Nazis to escape to South America, Middle East, and then to Asia. No wonder we have so much tension around the world at the present time. The story about Licio Gelli being arrested, Wall Street Journal, September 22nd, and September 28th is a picture of Vice President George Bush, who got on an airplane very quickly, of course, and showed up he was escorted by the Italian Prime Minister Giovanni Goria, and they were on their way to a meeting in Goria's office. Now, you can just imagine the conversation between George Bush and Goria. George Bush's brother, Prescott, is a Knight of Malta with the Vatican. He's part of the Americares organization, the Vatican branch that funds the Contras particularly. I won't do their worldwide operations, but Claire Luz and Alexander Hagan William Simon are Knights of Malta with Prescott Bush, and a good hunk of that money is in the Ambrosiano banks in Panama and the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. So Bush got his butt to Europe very quickly, and also the articles I've been citing from the new exposés of the arrests in Italy. These were the people that were going to kill Ronald Reagan in June, And at this point, George Bush would be President Bush visiting over there, so former director of CIA. So it was interesting that 4 days after Gelli was safely in a Swiss hospital, Bush went over to the office of the head of the Italian government. Newsweek had a small article, but important, September 28th, 1987, titled Iran-Contra Plot Missed. Well, the title should be Iran-Contra Plot Avoided. And it goes into the fact and makes apologies by saying that there were tight deadlines on the hearing and political caution have blocked some intriguing lines of inquiry into the Iran-Contra affair. Well, I might interject the way it was made up. They never intended to get there. It wasn't money or time. Well, if they opened it up, it would have taken a few years. That's true. If it's a tight deadline, they couldn't get into the matters that I've been discussing on this program for the past years. But Newsweek said if the Contras were really a key concern, the thinking goes, why did $3.5 million from Iran arms get to the Contras, and while there's $8 million remaining in these various banks? And they quoted Casey last November 21st. He volunteered that the National Security Council staff was guiding Contra supply operations. The Newsweek account says that one theory is that Casey wanted to limit the scope of the impending investigations to protect a wide range of activities, and perhaps one of the investigators or several said on the committee that they don't dismiss the theory that they missed other covert actions some witnesses were aware of, and possibly counterterrorism plans in the Middle East. Well, that's right. If they went into the area of the Reagan administration, they'd have the Bologna bombing, the Red Brigades, the murder of Aldo Moro, the Sadat murder, the Achille Laura hijacker, the TWA hijacking, the Roman Vienna airport hijacking, the Lebanon bombing when the 80 were killed, and a lot more. Obviously, when they opened that can of worms, they really couldn't go too far into it. A part of Bob Woodward's book, Veil, has been quoted in all the newspapers since this past Saturday. And one item that caught my interest, as much that we'll be talking about probably every week for years to come, was the fact that the CIA and the National Security Council wanted to kill Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah in Lebanon. So they planted a bomb. The CIA wouldn't do it. They had Saudi Arabia, their good friends, do it for us. And the bomb didn't get Fadlallah. It got 80 people, the identical number killed at the Bologna bombing. And again, another 160 were killed. And the CIA was doing what they do best. They all agreed that Israel would take the rap for it. Here is the United States government and Saudi Arabia making the arrangements, and Israel consents to take the rap in return for getting the weapons they need, and Saudi Arabia in return for getting the weapons they need. They don't care how many they killed, and when they didn't get the guy they wanted, they gave him $2 million, and he shut up, and that soothed everybody. It reminds me of the political assassinations in this country, where people involved who survive and members of their family know that there's been a conspiracy in their silence. And I know there must be a huge amount of cash that is put in their hands to keep them quiet so they won't open up the case. A perfect example is Coretta Scott King giving Ryosha Sasakawa the Medal of the Year, the Martin Luther King Medal, a year ago on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's death. A man who describes himself as one of the world's greatest fascists, and he gave $7 million to the Martin Luther King Institute. The Wall Street Journal also had an article last Tuesday titled, Europeans Slow the Flow of Arms to Iran. Now, the interesting part of this story is not only how many arms go to Iran from Europe, but the way the article begins, because by the time they get to the second paragraph, they're into the murder of two primary witnesses. And Wall Street Journal seems to be writing like Mae Brussell is talking. Years ago or months ago or weeks ago, they would tell a story and they'd refer to the late ambassador from Austria to Greece. Now they get right onto the business as soon as they tell the story. I'll just give you the opening lines. It said the police this month raided Linz, an office in Linz, Austria, the offices of Noricom AG, arms-making subsidiary of Bost Alpine. And I had that item on the air about 4 weeks ago. It set off a national scandal in Austria with front-page banners because this company was sending only $564 million worth of arms to Iran that I guess they found on the first papers. Noricom's former chief was arrested, and there were dark reminders that an Austrian ambassador to Greece and the former chairman of the company themselves, of Bost, both died suddenly while giving evidence on the case to the authorities. So right off the bat, they say that they note that while they were giving evidence about this scandal, these two particular people died and were off, an ambassador and the president of the company. Things aren't getting settled very long. Now, Arnaud de Borchgrave is a great master of disinformation, and he does a lot of it with his friend Michael Ledeen. And as the Middle East stories are breaking for the past 4 weeks in the news, the Washington Times, that is put out by Reverend Moon with de Borchgrave as editor, has to counteract always and bring up these same old smirky stories instead of getting into the facts as they're being unfolded. So they took one half of a page of the Washington Times, September the 11th, 1987, and there's a picture of Agca, Mehmet Ali Agca, behind bars. It says, here's Agca. He testified from a cage during the trial of the 3 Bulgarians and 4 Turks for the conspiracy to shoot the Pope. Now, that's hardly a new news story. There was a trial for a year, and they couldn't find evidence to the fact. But what they're doing is deflecting from the Middle East news, and the title, which is a non sequitur with Agca's picture, is Kremlin Faces Formidable Opponent in Vatican. And the gist of the whole article is that the Pope wants to go to the Kremlin again on the 1,000th year ceremony of the Christian Church next year in the Soviet Union. That's what the article's about. But this is the way it begins. How many divisions does the Pope have? You've heard that story. Joseph Stalin asked during World War II. Quite enough to make trouble might be Mikhail Gorbachev's answer. He didn't say it at all. They're just saying what he might have said. And it goes on. Enough trouble, perhaps, for the Kremlin to have connived in the attempted murder of John Paul II. True, an Italian court left moot the question of whether Bulgarians or the Soviets, most loyal satellites, were behind Agca and when he shot the Pope in St. Peter's Square, but Western intelligence sources say they don't want to speak publicly, but they remain convinced that Moscow approved of it. Now, there has been much evidence since of Theodore Shackley working for the P-2 for the Super Sesame in Italy, the Italian intelligence, arriving to work with Francesco Pazienza, and Pazienza was named by Agca as being one of the people behind the conspiracy to get him involved, and Frank Turpel, closely associated with the Stanford Technology Training Group, trained Agca, and the evidence of the secret team is very solid behind the Pope shooting and the agents involved there, including Michael Ledeen, who was the chief disinformation factor with Paul Henze from the CIA and Claire Sterling. So as the Middle East stories break, we are told once again, like we are every year on the anniversary of murder John Kennedy, that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. But this time, it's a big story that has nothing to do with the shooting of the Pope, except it begins that way and then goes into religion in the Soviet Union. But the main thing you see is Agca in a cage. Now, I was going to do 1 hour of this broadcast on newspaper translations that I've been getting from a listener in Italy. But because of the Veil, that book that Bob Woodward came out with, I want to get into some of the items that were just reprinted in the newspaper this weekend. So I'll give you just a couple of translations and then maybe, hopefully, get back to this, maybe really do a whole hour on it so that I don't disrupt the thoughts. But I want to share a few translations that I have. One is from La Repubblica, February the 2nd, 1987, the beginning of this year. And it has to do now with Gelli turning himself in and being linked in such great conservative papers with his bombing, extortion, and all the crimes that he's done. The article says, in September of 1985, the American government offered Licio Gelli an honorable surrender in the United States that would provide security measures and protection and adequate accommodation and precise agreement on his legal situation. This is the Waffen SS, the rat line with Barbie and the whole thing I went down with you, okay? Essentially, the Reagan administration and Edwin Meese assured the Grandmaster that if he appeared in the United States, he would receive special treatment in the United States. And, in fact, the State Department would call on Gelli personally to dictate the terms so he would not be arrested, he would not be extradited like Francesco Pazienza. Providing the Bologna magistrates with this surprising information was none other than Francesco Pazienza, who was slapped into a jail taken from the United States, and he's being charged with the Bologna bombing, and his co-partner is offered citizenship in the United States. Francesco Pazienza said from the bundles of papers he brought with him from New York, he pulled out a copy of a letter dated September 3rd, 1985, that was sent to a lawyer, Mario De Pietropalo, from a criminal lawyer in New York who had handled the case at the highest level of the Justice Department. To discuss the matter of Gelli, they would tell of having to meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Andreotti. At a certain time, the negotiations between the United States State Department and Gelli did come to a standstill. The reason wasn't clear. Perhaps the Grandmaster saw what happened to Pazienza, the co-collaborator of Mr. Santoviti, who in the end was not only arrested but extradited, and maybe he didn't trust Washington at this point. In the correspondence between the lawyers, Gelli uses the name Maurice III. His attorney is Paul Goldberger of the law office in New York of Goldberger and Dubin of New York City, and this was the letter. Dear Maurizio, after much preliminary work and discussion, I think we are in a most advantageous position for the plans discussed here in the United States. On behalf of Maurice, I am in a position to obtain a written agreement with the Justice Department confirmed at the highest level, which guarantees the most absolute way that points you and your client. Absolutely, there will not be any possibility of confusion in the pact. It will be binding in the United States courts. Some of this wording is turned around a little because it is someone translating the Italian newspaper. Maurizio, it is important that you understand the situation of Pazienza should not be regarded as precedent for all things concerning Maurice III. I must meet you and your client personally so I can proceed with the preparation. Then the agreement could be completed with the government in written form. Only when the agreement is safely in our hands will your client appear in the United States. All arrangements, including those concerning security form and accommodation, legal situation, etc., will be taken care of in advance to avoid your client any inconvenience. Heavens, we wouldn't want Licio Gelli to be inconvenienced at anything after building such a nice rat line and all the work he did for the P-2 and bombing all these people and setting up secret governments, including Henry Kissinger and Ladine and his super seismic, his great Italian network. Why would we inconvenience Licio Gelli? The letter concludes, at the moment, the circumstances are particularly favorable for obtaining everything you want. We are very close to settling the matter, and we will meet here as soon as possible, and the government has given the firm approval. This is the Reagan administration offering, in this time and period, a sanctuary to a man with such a horrendous record across the board, taking away money from the Banco Ambrosiano, funding the death squads, etc., etc., but nothing is too fine for the Reagan administration. Also in 1983, just after Pazienza was arrested, La Repubblica had an article March the 13th that the police, Interpol, the Italian intelligence, the CISIS, and the CISD, two separate branches, are holding a precise report about a very calm summer following the June 1982 hanging of their co-partner, Roberta Calvi, in London, and all the clues linked to Licio Gelli regarding the various happenings, and also he was spending the summer with his friend Francesco Pazienza and Mr. Carboni, who denied they didn't know Licio Gelli, but of course it turns out they did. The summer reports are part of 4 large dossiers put together by CISD on every move of Carboni. He was the last person with Roberta Calvi at the hotel and arranged the trip to England when he was hung. And the article goes on, there are 1,000 firms or dummy fronts made up by Carboni who are spread up and cover all of his shady activities. July 15th, 1982, that's a month after their good friend and president of Banco Ambrosiano was found dead in London. It continues, the dossier claims that Licio Gelli is in Gland near Geneva with Ortolani, Pazienza, and Carboni. Gelli seems to have a passport issued to Pietro Crisiolo, that's the name he used, and Pazienza, Carboni, and Adnan Khashoggi were all close associates. Adnan Khashoggi is the man that Oliver North and the National Security Council went to for $10 million to buy the original arms for Iran. And when Iran paid back the money, Khashoggi wasn't paid back. He and his friend Mr. Furmark, they sent some of it down to the Contras and kept some in their bank account. And that was part of the story that unraveled the whole Iran-Contra affair, because they went to William Casey. Mr. Furmark is a legal client of his, and Khashoggi has worked for the United States government for years, and said, hey, we want our bucks back. And at that point, things started rolling and brought the Iran-Contra affair just to the status that it is now. Not too much revealed, but plenty, enough to go on, as I say, for years to come. Now I'm going to take a 1-minute break. as I usually do at this moment. Now, I want to talk about the William Casey news that came over the air, but before I do that, there is a very important appointment that's taking place in Washington right now, and it has been stewing and brewing for the past 6 months, coming to a head in October, and of course, we don't learn about these things until October rolls around, unfortunately. This has to do with the appointment of a gentleman. If it's not him, it'll be somebody else, by the name of Kenneth Berquist. And the articles I'm citing here are San Francisco Examiner, September 27th, and the Washington Post had a long article. And if you want a scary face, go look up Washington Post, September 18th, 1987. He looks like these surreal television movies of the robot man that is being produced. His name is Kenneth Berquist. The government, the Defense Department, is splintering off what Ronald Reagan always wanted and had to a certain degree, that Special Operations Department. Berquist would be in charge of $2.5 billion, and what they want are groups of special armies that will go, it's called Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict Group, that will go into third world countries and knock them out, literally, get rid of people who oppose the exploitation and dictatorship. We will have what they call the counterinsurgency operations, uniting secret special operation units. They were put together immediately after Grenada, where the SEALs and Rangers could go in and exclude practically the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the beginning of another escalation that Ollie North started in 1980 with Secord and Hakim and Mr. Meadows from Peregrine with the rescue mission over in Iran, the failed rescue mission. And the point is that these private armies would have their own funding. They would be out of the arm of Congress. And Congress is fighting this. You have to write to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is the group hearing this, and they are hesitant to put private armies in the hands of this particular group with so much money, and one of their goals is to be out of the reach of Congress. And last April, they stopped their hearings or discussed it and discussed what they were going to do, and now it's October, and they're going to vote soon on these special commandos. And those are the kind of SS Gestapo that Adolf Hitler had, that ran the concentration camps, that were trained with blood and guts, that are fearless, that are accountable to nobody. This is a major decision of persons going off on their own, but part of the Defense Department where the Congress funds it, but the people don't have to know or vote, particularly people with a conscience. And as I say, if you are so inclined, get the Washington Post, September 18th, see Kenneth Berquist and see the man who'd be heading this. He's a Vietnam veteran. He was 5 years in Vietnam. He was at Stanford and then with the Special Forces and involved in these behind-the-scene counterinsurgency operations. And a quotation from the San Francisco Examiner, "I'm not anybody's yes man. I'm a longtime advocate of special operations, and you better believe it." He also is an ex-CIA employee, so he can pull on the Special Forces, the Defense Department, the CIA, and sort of be like an Ollie North managing from all the different areas and branches, have access to them. Now, getting to Casey's private war, not only William Casey, but the CIA and the Bob Woodward, the parts that were in the newspaper this week, I sat down yesterday to read the resumes and the first section that is serialized in the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Examiner, and I got about to the fifth paragraph, and I got so consumed in what I was seeing or reading that I decided to just work on that section and share it with you, and many of you will understand the reason why I was so interested. It has to do also with a letter that ties in very closely, a letter of a listener who wrote to Tony Coelho. He's a congressman from the 15th District of California, asking for a picture of Fritz Kraemer from the National Security Council, and the letter written back was September 15th, and Mr. Coelho wrote, Representative Coelho, "Thank you for contacting me regarding a photograph of Mr. Fritz Kraemer, who you thought was on the staff of the National Security Council. I contacted officials at the National Security Council, and they informed me that although Mr. Kraemer served as a consultant to the National Security Council in 1981, he was never on the staff of the organization. Since he was not a government employee, his photo is therefore not available for for any government agency. Now, that gets interesting when Evans and Novak said he was on the NSC through the greater part of the Reagan administration, but he was an advisor, not on the NSC, not a government employee. And again, Richard Secord left the Air Force in 1983, was no longer a government employee, and began to work, in quotes, with no salary for the Air Force, setting up these terrorist teams and the Swiss bank accounts with Hakim and the rest. And a lot of that is history. You know a great part of that. Now, Reagan was inaugurated January 21st, 1981. So Fritz Gustav Anton Kraemer, the one I talk about, who I think is one man with two different identities, was on and advising the National Security Council when Reagan took oath of office. And the new book coming out about the CIA, Bob Woodward, said that William Casey wanted the job as the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, but Alexander Haig got it. The excuse being, and Woodward knows better, that Nancy thought Haig was better looking and more upright, and Casey had floppy ears. Well, that's BS. The reasons: Haig, a Knight of Malta, was deep throat for Woodward, allegedly during the Watergate time, and Haig is a direct protege of Mr. Fritz Kraemer, gives him credit in his book. So Kraemer was setting up this transition new presidency in 1981 in the NSC, and Haig was Secretary of State. William Casey, a Knight of Malta with Haig, was active in the OSS, and then we'll go into his role as it begins in the unraveling of this story. He became the director of the CIA, and Henry Kissinger, who was a protege of Fritz Kraemer, was handed in 1983 Central American policy, with Ollie North walking around under the tutelage of Henry Kissinger, and Helene von Dahm, the secretary of Reagan, making appointments through this time period, who made appointments for 8 years in California, came from being a translator of international imaging that became Stanford Technology, whereby that team is hired by the White House to do all the work that Casey and those people are going to do. As Secord, Hakim, Shackley, Kleins, and Turple and Wilson were part of that group, and they were Stanford Technology Trading Group was the group in Switzerland with Mr. Willard Zucker, and the Swiss bank accounts were used between Iran and the Contras, with still almost $8 million sitting in the account of Merrill Lynch in London. The chairman of Merrill Lynch, of course, was Don Reagan, chief of staff. So the purpose of reading this letter now is to get a framework of where 1981 was with Casey, and Mr. Woodward is writing about Casey and the CIA through these various time periods, having been with Casey 48 times, the first 4 years of the Reagan administration. Now, in the book Veils, as the account begins, it starts with Casey wanting to have the job as Secretary of State of Defense. It goes to Haig, and then I indicate here that the member of Congress has said that Kraemer was the advisor of the NSC at this time. Now, William Casey, according to Bob Woodward, and these are his sentences that are particularly interesting because they give me a new light on pieces of the Fritz Kraemer puzzle that are not in by a long shot, but make things much more clear. Just by way of explanation for new listeners, because I don't update it every week or all the time, people that are not familiar with the Kraemer versus Kraemer story, a gentleman came to the United States in 1939, the year that Hitler invaded Poland. He was a German with a monocle, came from Frankfurt, Germany, and went to school in Frankfurt, Germany, then was in Mussolini's Italy. He left his wife and new baby in Nazi Germany in 1939 and came to the United States. His brother William wasn't so lucky. He was apprehended in jail or prison or whatever it is in England as a suspect as a Nazi spy. And this Kraemer came to the United States and then came into military intelligence, not an American citizen, and wearing his monocle, was active with the American military intelligence. And in 1943, he went to New Orleans and picked up another German, Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger credits him with being his mentor. And that Kraemer went to the Battle of the Bulge and into Europe until the end of the war, where they were in charge with other people, the very top Nazis after the war. And according to the American military reports, and I've sent for documents in Washington for quite a few of them, and in Maryland and in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in 1948, he moved into the Pentagon for 28 years, was the plans officer of the Pentagon, and was over General Westmoreland during the war, and was advisor to all of the particular persons in the Nixon administration with the Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the mentor of Kissinger, using the National Security Council for wars that Congress didn't approve, knew about but didn't approve. And then he, in quotes, retired from the Pentagon to be advisor to the National Security Council, and he shares offices with Daniel Graham in Washington. Daniel Graham was former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency that has a budget 10 times larger than the CIA, and Daniel Graham is the head of High Frontier, Star Wars, and it was a Nazi rocket scientist that said when they were brought to this country with Project Paperclip, and that's why they were brought here, if you control the space, you control the world, and many scientists know that Star Wars is a first strike. So that's the Kraemer that I talk about in regard to Alexander Haig. He was the mentor of Haig and Henry Kissinger, and you can look up his name in the index of books that these people have written or have been written about them. Now, Hitler had a favorite, Fritz Kraemer, and this is where William Casey's role comes in, reading this new material. Adolf Hitler had a very favorite, Fritz Kraemer. He was telephonically in touch with him up until at least January of 1944, and he organized Adolf Hitler and the top Nazis and the elite of the Waffen SS, the Gestapo, that they would be in a certain area of the Ardennes offensive, which is known as the Battle of the Bulge, and that they would be there and merge with the Americans at that point, at which point America would take them as prisoners of war. And then, as it turns out, William Casey was turning them into persons inside of Germany in the OSS and recycling them. But Adolf Hitler had this top, Fritz Kraemer, who was giving the orders for the 6th Panzer Division that met the American Army, and the American Fritz Kraemer was in the 84th Infantry Division in the same towns and places, which I went over again last night reading the Casey material, and realized that they were both in the same time and place, but obviously one wasn't. And Hitler's Kraemer could at that point be picked up at the Battle of the Bulge after traveling around and working and organizing and having come to this country, working with the likes of Kissinger, the OSS, because according to Woodward's book, he was given permission to recruit. He even recruited Nazis for his work in the Gestapo and had them in Berlin, over 282 minimum people working so that they could get into action as soon as the war was over and not lose a minute using these valuable people. Now, the little son, Sven Kraemer, that Fritz, the American, and I believe this is the same man, and I've been working on it for years, Kraemer, this is Kissinger and Haig's mentor, plans officer of the Pentagon. He left his little boy, Sven, S-V-E-N, in Nazi Germany during the war, brought the wife and Sven back to this country, and Sven went through the usual grammar school, prep school, went to Harvard, became a liaison in the National Security Council to Ronald Reagan, and Newsweek, September the 7th, 1987, says that Sven Kraemer is now assisting with the re-election campaign, the campaign of Representative Jack Kemp to become president. Newsweek says Representative Jack Kemp is preparing a huge mailing. This will go to all the Pentagon people, of course, and the Defense Intelligence Agency mailing list that Ollie North used. And they're about to land a prize catch for the Kemp campaign from the National Security Council. They will have arms control expert Sven Kraemer helping them. And also, several weeks ago, San Francisco Chronicle had an article about Jack Kemp's campaign, in case you're wondering. If you don't know much about Kemp, it said Kemp organizer in New Hampshire, State Senator John Chandler, was dismissed September the 4th, 1987, because during his campaign working for Jack Kemp, he was telling people he almost threw up when he saw Jesse Jackson publicly kiss a white girl in New Hampshire in 1984. He complained that race mixing is threatening the white race. Well, this is the son of Fritz Kraemer running the campaign. This is the kind of stuff they're talking. So we're not very far from the Fourth Reich, if you know what they talked about, Third Reich, if you knew what they talked about in the Third Reich, that after coming to America, getting the education, and now campaigning for the man, this is the kind of stuff that's coming out of their mouths. Now, this is what Bob Woodward wrote in just almost the beginning of the book, because I can't imagine what the next 300 or 400 pages have. It says, William Donovan, who was literally, he said, the godfather of William Casey, he was twice his age, and he was his mentor or godfather, both of them knighted by the Vatican as soon as the war was over. along with Reinhard Gehlen and James Angleton. William Donovan bestowed great responsibility on William Casey during the last 6 months of the war. And listen to this carefully, and you'll read it in the book. And then my mind began to churn about where our Fritz Kraemer and Hitler's Fritz Kraemer merged into one. Okay, Casey had written a memo saying the OSS must be ready to step up the placing of agents within Germany. Donovan said he wanted an instant spy network behind German lines, and he met William Casey in 1943 in Washington, D.C. 1943, by March, was the time when the book The Nazis Went Underground detailed their plans for the next Anschluss, being as they couldn't take the Soviet Union this time around. 1943 is when Donovan hired Casey for this job. 1943 is when Allen Dulles set up offices in Bern, Switzerland, in order to hire former Nazis, SS Karl Wolff. They were current Nazis then, running Treblinka and the camps and arranging for Reinhard Gehlen to come to this country, and the aerospace scientists, the Project Paperclip scientists. That was the role of Allen Dulles in Bern, Switzerland, working with the Gestapo at that time. And in 1943, besides the Nazis going under and all of these operations, is when Fritz Kraemer, in uniform, went to Louisiana and picked up Henry Kissinger, and all of a sudden they're going to be in the same town, on the same river, on the same day, right there in a town in the Ardennes forest. And I went back to my sources again, seeing what is happening now according to these reports of Casey. So Donovan has told Casey to get this together, and he relies on Casey, who was only 30 years old, very young, and he's written down some of it, the Chief of Secret Intelligence for European Theater. As best Casey could remember, Donovan's command was no more than get some guys in Germany. What was lacking in detail was made up in authority by Casey. By then, 31 years old, he was a full lieutenant. And of course, the Kraemer that I talk about, that became the plans officer for our entire Pentagon from Germany, ended the war as a lieutenant and nothing more, and never went to a war college. And Casey was a lieutenant, just as was Fritz Kraemer at that time period. But Casey commanded colonels, and he dealt with British and U.S. generals, more or less equals with him. His orders were get out of uniform, and he sent them to Selfridges on Oxford Street in London, where they would put on gray suits and all look alike. There was no rank. They had a job to do. Casey threw himself into every detail of spy running. He selected credible spies, and that was difficult, getting them into Berlin in the time period of February to May, April of May of 45, as the craziness is running down, scaling down, and the Germans are fleeing into the arms of the Americans by prearranged plans going back a year and a half. Woodward says it wasn't easy to get credible spies, and you bet it wasn't. Americans just wouldn't cut it at Gestapo headquarters, and you can believe that. And the Gestapo headquarters are the ones in Berlin where he wanted his agents. About 40 anti-Nazi prisoners of war, and I'll define anti-Nazi for you when I'm through with the Woodward story, were chosen. A violation of the Geneva Convention prohibition against the use of prisoners of war for espionage. Casey didn't blink at all. If they were anti-Nazi and Gestapo, he'd have them back in Berlin after the Americans took them. In February of 1945, there were 2 OSS people in Berlin in February. But in January of 45 is when the top Waffen SS were rounded up by those people that merged in these towns. And by February, there were only 2 in Berlin. But miracles happened. Casey had 30 teams in Berlin by the next month, which is March. A team is 4 to 10, but give them a minimum of 4, it would be 120. But 1 month later, William Casey had 58 teams of Gestapo, Waffen SS, his teams inside of Germany. Former prisoners, well, they were prisoners of war. They're not former. They were just grabbed. And who was he to grab? The very people I've been talking about on the air for a long time, like Sepp Dietrich and Fritz Kraemer and Joachim Peiper and von Rundstedt and Modell, who commit suicide shortly after he was rounded up. And Casey had a team even for prostitution, code-named Chauffeur, to get the various prominent people, I guess, so you could control them politically for years to come. So after reading that account of how these people were rounded up at that particular moment, I got out two sources that I've had on the air at various times and began to reread them to see what I was relating to this account of Casey's operation with the Gestapo and prisoners of war. And one account I went to were letters I got from Washington, D.C., from the Defense Investigative Service regarding Fritz Gustav Anton Kraemer. And then I went to the historical book written regarding the Battle of the Ardennes Offensive, put together by Mr. U.M. Cole, which Waffen SS Fritz Kraemer helped him write. They acknowledge he wrote the history of the Battle of the Bulge, and in his own history, I've cited over 710 pages before, where his name is only in there one time. So I looked up again, where was this Fritz Kraemer this one time, where he's writing about himself, because the other Kraemer was, according to the American Army, was in the 84th Division. And what I found is that the Waffen SS Kraemer, who was telephonically in touch with Adolf Hitler until the moment he embraced the American Army, and these volumes give you the page numbers of the fact that Hitler was in touch with him, they were in a town called Mannheim, which is referred to as the Crossroads, and now I see why the book Crossroads of Death is the merger of the Waffen SS with the American Army, because this is where they merged the 84th Infantry Division that the German Fritz Kraemer that was in American uniform was supposed to be in, merged with Hitler's Waffen SS Kraemer in the town of Mannheim and on the Aisne River, Aisne, and also at Erzee in Germany. Now, in the time period from December 20th to 24th is when these battles merged together, when they came together. There was that 4-day period. But by January 1945, the Americans had taken those Waffen SS, those choice people, as prisoners. And, of course, William Casey could use them. In the report of the meeting and the merging of these people, on page 577, this is a 700-page history of World War II, just the Ardennes Offensive. It said that the 84th Infantry Division, and this is the Army papers that I got from the American monocled German Fritz Kraemer, 84th Division set out patrols and counted its prisoners. There were 592 for the Verdun engagement. By January the 1st, 1945, New Year's Day, the 84th had this 592 choice prisoners that later, many of them could be identified for working for the United States government. And the Army account tells about the 84th Division working in the same cities as the account of the Nazis in other books, meeting on the Liège Highway and in the town of Mannheim, and also on page 580 of the American official report of the war, it says the SS Panzer Corps and the 6th Panzer Division, run by Fritz Kraemer, linked with the Americans at the crossroad. Hitler himself would be giving the orders telephonically. That's page 580. And 576 said the 6th Panzer Division of Kraemer crossed the Meuse River near Liège with Sepp Dietrich. Adolf Hitler was personally directing the battle. December 24th, 1944, that's page 578 and 591, with Mr. von Rundstedt and Model, the famous Model. Now, this Kraemer, who was so important to Adolf Hitler, could and has and was taken a prisoner, because we have seen him in the docket at Dachau, prisoner number 33. But the first thing Senator Joe McCarthy did when he went in the United States Senate, and he wasn't assigned to this operation at all, this wasn't part of his Senate duties, was to make sure that all those prisoners taken at Malmedy were released promptly. And they were released. Some had a 10-year sentence, some had a life sentence, but they were, in fact, released. I'll be doing more on this later, but and trying to untangle maybe for you some of the confusing points. But the point is that seeing the role that Casey had with these top prisoners of war and how easily he could put them in the Gestapo in Berlin and call them OSS, and Otto von Bolschwing, the president of the Transcomputer International that became Stanford Technology Trading Group, was in the Waffen SS till just before the war was over, and he was put in the OSS. So it turns out that William Casey was in fact responsible for those people in Berlin and had been working on it since 1943 and was ready to move with them when the war was over. Well, this concludes the first part of World Watchers Before I finish, I want to say that the views expressed on this program, again, are those of myself and not necessarily reflecting the views of Kazoo staff or board of directors. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185 for the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you this past hour of World Watchers. And again, the previous hour of World Watchers was made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. This is Mae Brussell. It is KAZU, Radio with a Choice, and you hang in there. This next hour is yours. It's your turn to call and tell me what you're reading or hearing. There is just so much news. Share your ideas and thoughts.